Chapter 18. The howling and desperate voices increased in intensity while they were talking, to the point when Dan couldn't take it anymore. "Why don't you go back to where you belong?" he shouted in the direction of the forest. Damien laughed. They will be haunting the forest now, unless Damienos can find a way to liberate their souls from limbo. "Talking about being in limbo," Dan said, returning his attention to Damien. "Why didn't you show yourself while we were in the house?" "I couldn't," is the simple answer to your question, Dan. "And why is that?" Malou queried in turn. "Because my wife is the one who is the dream catcher, and the one who came back to her past, as you can see." Damien looked down at his chest. "I didn't have the privilege to revisit my past as she did." "But how did you die then?" Dan asked Salangi. "You said—"
"Yes, Dan. I died soon after I'd finished the last dream catcher. It was a silly accident, really. I was trying to reach the top shelf of one of the bookcases and fell off the chair."
"Why you were looking for the book?"
"Yes, Malou. And since I couldn't return to Pahokee, my time to do so had long passed by then. I welcomed the opportunity to join Damien where he was dwelling."
She smiled at Damien. "But you came back."
"No, dear. We didn't come back anywhere. Remember, everything you see and feel right now is only in your imagination."
"What about them?" Dan asked, pointing at the vaporous figures still howling in the forest. "Are we imagining them too?" "Perhaps you are, but that's not important now," Damien replied. "What's important for you both, however, is to finish reading the book and see what it has still in store for you."
"But you said that we had proved ourselves worthy already. What else is there for us to do?"
Malou asked.
"Think of your dream and the dream maker that will help you reach your goals in life,"
Salangi suggested.
"The last pages of the book will tell you what you have to do before you go back, I'm sure."
It seemed that the only way to find answers to their dilemma and to ignite the powers of the dream maker was to open the book to its last pages. Damien looked up at Dan and Salangi before he did. "I hope we're not going to regret this," he mumbled to Malou, who was already looking down at the book intently.
"All right, here goes nothing,"
he said, lifting the book once again. Unlike the first time he opened it, the now blank pages flipped quickly to the last chapter.
"But there's nothing written in the first chapters," Malou remarked, raising her gaze to Damien and Salangi.
"That's because the first pages of the book did not concern you," Damien replied.
"But I remembered the writings when we were running in the forest right now," Dan objected. "You were probably prompted by one of the ghostly figures to do so, didn't you?" Salangi queried.
"And now that you mention it, yes, one of them threatened us, saying something about death awaiting us." "Yes, that sounds like something they would say. Revenge and envy reside in the heart and soul of those who could not accomplish their own tasks," Damien rejoined.
"All right then, let's see what that last chapter says for us to do," Dan said.
"You have been proven worthy of opening this book to this last chapter. Therefore, you are now at liberty to receive the powers of the Dream Maker, those powers that will enable you to accomplish 12 tasks, to assist you in reaching your goals and for you and for your progeny."
"Wow," Dan said when he lifted his gaze from reading the first paragraph. "That's some gift." "But as they say, there's no free lunch," Malou said, reading the following paragraph over Dan's shoulder.
"The first task will demand that you retrace your steps to the house of Mary and find answers to exercising tolerance and understanding. Tolerance will free you from the sin of obsession."
"How are we supposed to find tolerance in that house?" Malou asked. "It's just an old house filled with books." "Is it really?" Salangi asked, turning her head to face the house that now seemed covered in a cloak of mist and fog.
"Good God," Dan exclaimed when the four of them saw the house being transformed into St. Mary's Church of Pahokee. That church is the one we saw before we left to go through the painting."
"And it's the one where I found the old Indian who allowed us to have 3 more days before we had to go back."
"You mean you went in the church?" Dan asked, looking at Malou curiously.
"Not exactly, honey. I was looking for the old Indian in my dream, and I found him in front of the church, painting some other picture. But I told you about that when we were in the coma, didn't I?"
"Maybe you did," Dan replied, shrugging and returning his attention to the book. "Let's see what comes after finding tolerance."
"You won't find anything written about the first task," Salangi said. "One step at a time, Dan. You see, once you have accomplished the first task successfully, the book will reveal the next task, and so on, until you have accomplished all 12 of them."
"And what happens if we fail one of them?" Malou asked.
"A thought of failure, dear, will already take away half of your chances of success. Remember, these tasks will enable you to gain the powers to see all of your dreams come true. That's what a dream maker is all about."
"How did you know about all of this since you didn't find the book?" Dan asked.
"Once I joined Damien, I asked him to explain the significance of that book."
She looked up at her husband with the eyes of love.
"And he showed me what he had read as a young man, which allowed us to accomplish our dreams. And when I returned to the house to meet you, I knew a couple, much like us, would be designated to reach the powers of the Dream Maker."
Dan turned his gaze to the hill that was now surrounded with luxuriant foliage. Such as was the case for St. Mary's Church in Pahokee. Piercing through the top of the trees at the tip of its small spire was a golden cross that now seemed to glow eerily in the afternoon sun.
"Isn't that beautiful?" Malou said, looking up at the cross. "I knew that church had to mean something when I first saw it."
"Yes, well, let's see if we can find tolerance inside," Dan said, taking Malou by the arm and leading her up the hill.
"Are you coming too?"
Malou asked, turning her head to Damien and Salangi. Salangi smiled.
"Oh no, dear. This is something you have to do entirely on your own, but we'll be right here when you come back."
A few moments later, as Dan and Malou turned into the front garden of the church, they saw Damienos waiting for them on the front steps. "And you thought I would be otherwise occupied, didn't you?" he sneered.
"Not again, Damienos," Dan shouted, glaring at the figure of a muscular man barring their passage.
"I'm getting a little tired of your interference, you know that." "Ha!" Damienos laughed. "Yes, I thought you would be tired of seeing me by now. But you see, and as Damien told you, I have to look after the spirits in my charge."
"But we're not spirits, and we're not in your charge,"
Malou objected. "Oh, but you are, dear Malou. You are. In fact, dead or alive, when a soul is assigned to me, I am bound to bring it back to where it belongs."
"Then why don't you look after those souls that came out of the book and are now hollering through the forest?"
"Oh, they can wait. They've waited for a long time already. 1 more hour all day won't make a difference to them now."
"So now you've decided to make it difficult for us to accomplish our tasks, is that it?"
"If not impossible, Dan, that's my job," Damienos answered.
"All right, if that's what you want, that's the way it's going to be," Dan said, taking Malou's hand and dragging her to her knees with him. The gesture surprised her no end. She knew her husband to be a spiritual man, but not one given to prayers. "Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name," he began praying along with Malou. Both their heads bowed, they didn't let up, until they pronounced the last word of the Lord's Prayer, and then lifted their eyes to see nothing else but a small black cat with a white patch over its head, resting on the bottom step in front of the church.
"Tolerance, Dan, and understanding will get you everywhere," they heard Damienos snigger as he licked his front paws to wipe his ear.
"Look,"
Malou said, her eyes raised to the cross.
"It's shining down to the church's entrance." "Yes, I see that, and maybe the good Lord has decided to show us the way," Dan remarked as the both of them climbed the few steps separating them from the impressive braces of doors.
"Do you think these doors will open?" an anxious Malou asked, placing a hesitant hand on the heavy brass knocker.
"Maybe we should say, 'Open Sesame,'" Dan replied jokingly, looking up at the ray of light that seemed to accompany them now.
And then, as if someone had heard their thoughts, the 2 doors opened wide. Malou and Dan stopped in awe, for what met their gazes was quite unbelievable. It seemed that the entire church, the nave, altar, and apse, was shrouded in a luminous golden glow.
"What do you think we should do now?" Malou asked Dan in a whisper.
"Let's go to the altar," Dan said, holding on to her hand tightly. "Maybe there is a priest around here."
"How can I help you, my son?" a balding man asked as he walked toward them.
"We're here to find tolerance," Malou replied quietly, while admiring the simple robe and vestment that appeared to envelope the aging fellow.
"Oh, yes. An interesting quest, I'm sure, and one you should be able to find easily if you find the opposite."
"The opposite?" Dan queried, wide-eyed. "You mean we have to find intolerance in order to understand tolerance?"
"Precisely, my son. You see, intolerance in this world can be found everywhere, but only when you recognize it and accept its damaging effects on the soul will you find tolerance."
"But there isn't any intolerance in this church, is there?" Malou asked, looking around her.
"Perhaps not around here, my dear, but let me show you."
Then, joining words to action, the priest turned toward the altar and opened his arms wide to welcome images of some of the world's intolerance. As if facing a moving scene, Dan and Malou saw horrific treatments of intolerant dictators, heads of states, and even that of more familiar people, such as a father slapping his child for disobedience, or as that of a baker chasing a hungry boy for having stolen a loaf of bread, and many more, all of them demonstrating what an intolerant soul could do. When the images dissipated, the priest turned to them once again.
"You see, Dan and Malou, when your heart is invaded with intolerant behavior, your mind responds to the devil's instructions without respite."
"But we're not anything like these people," Dan argued, looking at the priest sternly. "We have a good home, beautiful children, and a wonderful family and friends. All very plausible and admirable situations, I'm sure, Dan, yet Damianos has shown you many a time that he could raise your intolerant behaviour until you had to fall to your knees in prayer. But he's only a miserable cat that... He's none of what you can imagine him to be. He has a task to perform, and if you intolerate him, as you saw a couple of occasions, he will be there to attend to your wishes.
Do you mean I have to tolerate his insolence and interfering behaviour?
Oh yes, and much more than that, because he will push you to the brink of despair, as easily as he did with the other souls that were tired of his impertinence.
So what do we do now? Baloo asked.
Go out there. Damianos is waiting for you, the priest said, disappearing from sight suddenly.